Hello, welcome to the Polin Museum. My name is Artur Markowski and I'm senior historian here at the museum. It is my pleasure to see you in our museum. Well, today I have a great honor to introduce Professor Rudolf Klein. Okay. His lecture is a part of, I think, amazing workshop, Building Culture and Community, Jewish Architecture and Urbanism in Poland. Although official opening is planned for tomorrow morning, but I would like to stress that that Professor Klein's lecture is not only integral part of this workshop, but also it's a key element of our discussion and important inspiration for tomorrow and for Friday discussions. Well, let me say a few words about Professor Klein, about our keynote speaker. He's professor of 19th and 20th century architectural history of St. Stephen University in Budapest, formerly at Tel Aviv University David Azrieli School of Architecture. He researched 19th century synagogues and Jewish cemeteries in Central Europe, as well as Jewish contribution to secular architecture from early emancipation to late 20th century. He's an author of many books. I have one, the latest book of by Professor Klein, published in 1918. Yes, last year. Yeah, Metropolitan Jewish Cemeteries in Central and Eastern Europe. I think can I show this? Yeah.
You should pass it, I guess.
So, I think that we are waiting for the lecture. So, Professor Klein, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I really feel honored to have attracted relatively many people, if we consider this is only one single lecture. So, yeah. I have to thank Cecil Kuznits for entrusting me with this task and the opportunity to practically present my latest book, which is related to the idea of Jewish urban presence, as it is about major cemeteries in Europe, metropolitan Jewish cemeteries in Europe. A bit about the history of this book. As a young architect, I wanted to become a Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, or Franco Gehry. You know, the list is pretty long. And I didn't want to deal with synagogues and cemeteries. But I realized that I have to do this contribution. I started dealing with synagogues some 30 years ago when one synagogue was really endangered and it had to be rescued. The similar story is the cemetery story. Some 12 years ago, I encountered a cemetery in a very, very bad shape in Budapest, completely neglected by the authorities, monument preservation authorities, and I decided that I will make this cemetery famous. At least I will organize something, publicize, go to conferences, and then it will start this process to for the nomination to the World Heritage. UNESCO World Heritage. And the byproduct of this endeavor is this book and this lecture. This presentation has basically 6 major points. The first is the problem of text and the Jewish heritage. Really, the cemetery funeral art is a par excellence issue of text, historically at least, regarding the Jewish context. Then the aims of my research, brief history of Jewish cemeteries before emancipation, and the bulk of the material refers to the period of emancipation. And then I would try to summarize the lesson of the cemeteries for history, cultural history, and some practical issues regarding maintenance and insemination. It's a very poetic metaphor to relate a cemetery to the scripture. And I would venture into this comparison, saying that Jewish cemeteries, I mean traditional Jewish cemeteries, are like pages of chronicles, are like pages of the scripture or the Torah scrolls, with the gravestones like Hebrew letters, very densely set. From around you have the margin, then you have the fence around the cemetery. So it yields to such a comparison. Moreover, originally gravestones had only text as decoration in a wider sense of the word, because the text, the scripture, and the Hebrew letters are really having this aesthetic message. However, very early, and you will see soon, that this texture part was accompanied by some visual elements. Basically, if we have a Torah commentary by Rambam, which is pure text, then we have the tablets of the law, which is basically pure text. But in the gravestones, you see on the gravestone on the right-hand side, there is already a little symbol. This is from the Batonstrasse cemetery in Frankfurt, Main, where each house in the city where Jews lived had a symbol. And then when somebody passed away, this symbol was carved on the gravestone. So there is a communication between the space they spent their life and the space where they ended that life. Then again from the Batonstrasse cemetery on the right-hand side, a representation could be even defying the image ban. There are many human figures on these graves in Frankfurt. I counted some 12, 13 with human representation, but parallel with the text. And illumination, manuscript illuminations are also having visual representation, and sometimes, like here in this image, there is a combination, and then the visual representation frames the text. By time, however, the significance of text started to recede and give place to the visual representation, and it's a long-standing process. The first image is Gothic period Jewish gravestone with just letters and a frame. Then we have a typical I won't say it's not really a scientific term, Polish gravestone, but a traditional gravestone in which 2/3 are text, and over the text you have a whole set of visual representations that is present also in the Okopova Street Cemetery. And then on the right-hand side, I on purpose took another Polish cemetery, the cemetery in Łódź, where you see that the text is diminishing, and it's a visual representation, and not only a visual representation, it's a sculptural representation that bulges out from the surface. So it goes against the recommendation of Maimonides, who said that 2D representation is still a sort of okay. When it is carved in, it starts being dangerous, but when it bulges out, then it is really bordering with idolatry. In order to pursue cemetery research and to be able to evaluate cemeteries for UNESCO World Heritage, I had to make a system of criteria which are really the guiding principle to evaluate a cemetery. First is the urban aspect. The cemetery is a necropolis. It's a city of the dead, so everything that we encounter in a real city could be transferred to a cemetery, and the cemetery is really an image, a mirror picture of the Jewish community and the city. The next issue is very social and very famous to talk about, very fashionable to talk about today, is segregation. The Jewish cemetery is a highly segregated place that we will see soon. Gender segregation, segregation in terms of knowledge, segregation in terms of wealth, which is an issue. And it's interesting that each and every cemetery is different in this respect. The third and probably the largest chapter, urban chapter regarding the cemeteries is morphology. Cemeteries are having streets, having little squares. Originally, a Jewish cemetery was densely knit text, grave after grave. But during emancipation, Jews took over from the Christians this urban aspect of cemeteries, so cemeteries could be analyzed with the same methods as urban fabric. Then, from this topic comes out the grouping and coupling of gravestones, married couples, families, and then extended family. If you start researching a cemetery, you would discover that family members tended to be close to each other. So if you take the urban situation of the Jews, how they purchased urban plots is similar to the cemetery. So they like to be in adjacent plots in the city, that they can go from each plot to the other without going to the public street. So it's a mesh, it's a network of human relations. The next issue is the border between the cemetery and the environment, meaning fences, gates that open these spaces, and buildings inside the cemetery, like tahara houses, ceremonial buildings, workshops, and so on. The next item is collective memorials. Historically, collective memorials didn't really exist. Collective memorials became fashionable by the end of the 19th century when Jews took part in the life of Christians, when they were conscripted to the armies, World War I, World War II, Balkan Wars, Holocaust, pogroms, and this is a very special genre of gravestones. Below the image we have shape and material of the gravestones, a basic formal typology regarding the form, regarding the material, and regarding the link between the gravestones themselves. Then a topic that was widely researched, symbols. But symbols were researched mainly traditional Jewish symbols. But from the 19th century onward, when Jews started to take an active part in the metropolitan life in Europe, secular symbols started to appear on Jewish gravestones. We will see later. Then the style is probably not that very prominent in the case of Jewish gravestones, but it's still one of the considerations. Then we have orientation of the gravestones, which was basically similar to the synagogues, that gravestones had to face east or had to face south. So the directions the Jews would take after resurrection when they head towards Jerusalem. And it's not just the simple gravestone that was oriented, but also the gates of the cemetery. So traditionally, the gates of Jewish cemeteries were on the eastern side or southern side. And then comes the problem of inscription of names, language, lineage description, traditional Jewish description, and modern secular Jewish name. And the inscription has also eulogy, the contribution of this Jewish person, which changed. Before emancipation, it was listed how pious he was, how generous he was, how knowledgeable he was in terms of Jewish sciences. And after emancipation, it is a mere social contribution that the person had a big factory, then you have a depiction of the factory. Or the person was an opera singer, and then you have a depiction of the opera house, and so on and so forth. Or a soccer player, and you will see these examples. Vegetation is an aspect which is pretty problematic. Halachically, vegetation was not welcomed by by the Jewish establishment because of the problem of trees. Trees pose a problem because they can bear fruit, and then the status of this fruit is problematic. It's definitely not kosher. The other problem is the problem of Kohanim, who are not allowed to be in the same space with the corpse. So if foliage is taken as an architectural space, and it is usually taken as an architectural space, then Kohanim can't enter such a space. So the problem that communities faced either to cut the trees out completely or to trim them, that the Kohanim go through and they are not covered, they are not under the same spatial umbrella as the gravestones. And the last item, which figures here quite modestly, is the problem of damages. How to cope with damages, how to restore graves, and how to mark graves that have been completely destroyed. Now, a very, very short Jewish cemetery history. The first example is Beit Shearim, a cave cemetery, which was the typical way of burying the deceased. And in these caves, there are sarcophags. And the interesting thing is that I was always skeptical when people started speaking about Jewish architecture and Jewish art, because there is an architecture which is created or used, commissioned by Jews, but giving the Jewish as an adjective is problematic. And it's a similar idea with Jewish art, which does have some specific features, but to take it as Christian art in a continuity, or Buddhist art or Islam art, is a problem. Because in every moment of Western cultural history, you see the impact of the neighbors. So in this case, you see the Greco-Roman impact on Jewish gravestones. However, Jewish Jewish decoration, these should be lions. They are not exactly showing the image of a lion, but we can be certain that these are lions. Regarding the people who were buried there, the family, and the significance of the location, it's interesting that there are spaces. They are not just tunnels dug into the soil, but these are spaces with little squares, with crossings. So this urban aspect does apply for even grave cemeteries in caves. Jerusalem is definitely a fulcrum of Jewish culture, and it has a 5,000 years old funerary history, in which Jewish funeral culture started relatively early in the period of the Second Temple. And across the Kidron Valley, we have the great Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives, which is having at the moment roughly 70,000 individual graves. So it reached size of a typical European metropolitan Jewish cemetery. Here we have a parallel, different modi of burial. The first and the oldest, a bit sluggish, this pointer, the caves, and then you have the grave of Zechariah, which is already, in quotation marks, a building. It's not a building, it's carved out from the soil. And what is interesting about this gravestone, it shows up in 19th century cemeteries as a reference to Jewish funerary art in the antique period. This is the beginning of West European or Ashkenazi funerary culture of the Jews. The big cemetery, medieval cemetery in Worms, which is part of this series of Speyer Worms mines called Schum. That was founded before the First Crusade. It was a relatively good period of Jewish history before the First Crusade, and after the Crusades, problems started to emerge. And by the mid-14th century, Jews were expelled from the German Sprachraum. It was exactly 1346 after the plague epidemic. So we have typical medieval Jewish gravestones with only inscription and an organic layout of the cemetery where they basically faced east. This is the famous Martin Buber Blick, Martin Buber view. Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, often visited the Jewish cemetery in Worms, and this was his vantage point from which he mused about the link between the Jews and Germans, the Yiddish and these German roots of Jewish culture. And of course, in the background we have the Romanesque Cathedral of Worms, and in front of us are the Jewish gravestones, actually the background of the Jewish gravestones, and on the next image we have the front of the same gravestones. When Jews were expelled from German-speaking countries, they found refuge in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and East Central Europe, and it is the example of Prague, the old cemetery in Josefov, which is basically medieval in terms of foundation, but in terms of the number of gravestones, it is from Renaissance times onwards. It's interesting that here you have the types. You have the typical vertical gravestone, which is called matzeva, here. And then you have a gravestone, a double gravestone for rabbis. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
My grandma sang Isolde in the opera, so I guess I inherited something from this. So you have two vertical slabs, and then you have a slab that connects these two verticals. And this is the shape that will show up until yesterday. Another image of this Prague Josefov cemetery, which bears witness to the Prague Renaissance, the golden age, age of Maximilian and Rudolf II, after whom I got my name. And this Rudolf II was a pretty poor weak ruler who was liberal. I mean, as a weakness was shown as a liberalism, and Jews had quite a good opportunity to take part in this flourishing Renaissance, which ended basically in the Baroque period with Maria Theresa, the zealous Catholic empress, who expelled the Jews in 1745. And interestingly, when she passed away, and Joseph II, the very liberal emperor and king, came to power, he announced his Edict of Tolerance in 1781, and this meant the end of traditional Jewish life. It was the beginning of emancipation in Habsburg lands, and with that the traditional closed Jewish community became open. These open Jewish communities built cemeteries that were open to the artistic expression of the Gentiles. There were different influences, different meanings. This is the Central Friedhof in Vienna, where the neoclassical influence is very strong. What is interesting that these obelisks and edifices are not from the period of neoclassicism. Interestingly, in the period of neoclassicism, Jewish gravestones were still very traditional, meaning until 1830, 1840. This taking over the Western Greco-Roman architectural languages basically after the revolutions of 48, and particularly after the Austro-Hungarian agreement, when Jews got almost complete civil rights and became integral part of period societies. Nevertheless, not all of the Jewish communities followed this path, and this is the Orthodox cemetery in Bratislava, Pressburg, at that period, which is pretty traditional. And what is interesting, it is a relatively large cemetery, some 7 hectares, so it is not a small Orthodox cemetery, which was metropolitan in terms of size, but in expression it was traditional. Now this slide also serves to show the urban context. Jewish cemeteries from the very beginning were not close to the settlements. This was a rule because of the status of corpses that were not clean. Even clean, they were not clean, and they had to be buried further away from the cemetery, from the city center. While in Catholic and Muslim culture, the first gravestones appeared around the church and around the mosques. Even in European soil, I'm not speaking about Arab countries, European soil, if you go to Sarajevo, you will find that the most important members of the Muslim community are around the mosque in the city center on the riverside, and the rest is a bit further. Segregation. Segregation, the first really and most important segregation is gender segregation. And on the gravestones, you have a display of gender symbols. They are not exactly gender symbols, but they are symbolizing the role of gender in Jewish, everyday Jewish life, particularly life in Shabbat. So you have these gravestones. I took on purpose a modern cemetery, the cemetery in Łódź, where you have some sections or some parts of sections that are exclusively men, and they are represented by the bookshelf. They are the ones who read, and women are represented with a candle who are lighting the candle for Shabbat. So this is the traditional segregation. And on the right-hand side, you have a modern segregation, late 19th century. On the right-hand side, you have the rich people, and on the left-hand side, you have middle classes. And this segregation goes on in various types. Now, let me show you what happens to married couples. When they pass away, the first image, this is a section for women. Then, in the same cemetery, it is Łódź above and below. The first occasion that husband and wife are together, but they are not sharing the same gravestone. They are sharing the foundations, and then they have two slabs. And then the next case is a case from Wrocław, when we have already still two separate slabs, but they are framed with one neo-Gothic frame. Morphology. This is this urban aspect. This is a cemetery in Salgótarjáni Street in Budapest, which is almost a Roman castrum. It has a cardo and it has a decumanus. And interestingly, these places where the two streets cross each other is the place for very eminent people to be buried. But here you have a different type of segregation. From this street to the right are spiritual leaders. So there is a lane for the rabbis, community leaders. And then you have, to the left-hand side, a section for the rich. So there is a differentiation between them. What happens to children? Initially, children were separated in different sections. It is a bit different in Ashkenazi and Sephardi cemeteries, but this is the basic idea, that they are away from the parents, and they started being buried together with the parents in the 1880s, roughly. And then what happens? People who committed suicide and criminals, they are also not in the context of these okay people. Morphology. As you see, I collected different morphological cases which could be defined after Kevin Lynch, who was the scholar who worked first in the 1960s on urban morphology. You have paths, so you have a path and lined up with gravestones. Of course, in the 19th century gravestones, if you have such a markant pathway, the gravestones are not allowed to face this with the sides. So they started rotating the gravestones. Around the 1870s and 80s, the gravestones are losing eastern and southern orientation, and they are facing the path. And with that, on the crossing, you got already corner plots, like in the city. So in the corner, you have to address the corner, and this meant that gravestones had to play this role. Here we have the idea of path, 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 edge. So when they create a sort of wall, another situation of edge, it is along the perimeter wall. Or arcades, they are also edges. And then you have districts, some territories without definite streets and squares. This is another edge where the gravestones create a wall which marks space in a rather urban manner. Arcades. By the end of the 19th century, rich Jews were quite competitive, not only in the economic life of a city, but they were competitive also in the cemetery. And they built higher and higher monuments. And Hebra Kadisha didn't like the idea. Nobody really liked this idea of this competition. So by the end of the 19th century, there was an idea to curb these appetites and to create arcades into which some Jewish families would move in. It wasn't really successful because some families could agree to make such an arcade. It's in Budapest, but the real successful arcade was created in Zagreb. Why? Zagreb has a multi-confessional cemetery which has a Jewish section with these two domes flanked by 6-pointed stars. Then you have 3 domes that are Catholic. Then you have a dome which is Greek Orthodox, and you have a Greek Orthodox cross over it. And then you have another one for the Protestants. And as Gentile gentry started to move into these arcades, these Jews followed suit, and they were happy to be in the same arcades with the nobility. And many Jews were, of course, ennobled Jews. Of course, they started buying nobility. It was basically paid for, either directly to the state as a sort of tax, or just showing generosity vis-à-vis some institutions in the city, opera houses, concert halls, so on and so forth. The gate. The gate is really symbolic. Basically, you have 2 gates. One gate is serving to connect the non-Jewish space with the forecourt of the cemetery, and the next gate is connecting the forecourt with the cemetery proper. The first example is Prague, and it of course has the leading architectural style and language of the place. So it is a late 19th century Austro-Hungarian freestyle. The image in the middle is a very interesting example. It's Łódź, an industrial city. I will talk about it later in detail, where this brick architecture of the industrial buildings shows up also in the cemetery. And the last example is definitely Southern Europe, the stone tradition, the gate to the Sephardic cemetery in Sarajevo. Collective memorials. Collective memorials are basically the biggest ones, are referring to the Holocaust, but they are not the only ones. This is a memorial to the Jews who perished in the forced labor units of the Hungarian army. During World War II, Jews were not conscripted to the army because they were not considered reliable enough. So they were this labor units for mine cleaning, for doing building work. Curiously, they survived in much higher percentage than the Jews who were not conscripted, because the Jews who remained in a civilian status were transported to Auschwitz, and these survived in Russia, wherever, falling into captivity, and many of them returned. Some of them definitely not, and they got this big section in the Budapest Kozma Street cemetery. And the interesting thing is that first they had a list and built this matzevot, one besides the other, and then they discovered that some people were missing, so they are simply adding additional plaques to this monument. On the upper part of the slide is the First World War monument in Budapest, the First World War monument of Berlin Weissensee Cemetery for the Jewish soldiers passed away. I mean, Jewish heroes, they were euphemistically called heroes. But for First World War, it does apply because Jews were quite eager to show that they were emancipated, and very often voluntary they joined the Christian brethren and went to fight practically each other, French Jews, German Jews, which was the problem of emancipation. And below you have the biggest Holocaust memorial on Central European soil, a memorial to 600,000 perished Hungarian Jews. Now we come to the typology. Grave typology. The two basic types are the horizontal slab, which is the Sephardic tradition, which could be a simple slab into some polygonal, forgive me for the labeling, Toblerone type monuments, or these prisms, pseudo-sarcophagi. And then from the middle of the second row, we have here the Ashkenazi tradition. This is a temporary stone, it's actually metal. And then you have the tradition of vertical stones, the matzevot. What is interesting that this type is historically overarching from the medieval period until yesterday. It's true that in the meantime there were, in quotation mark, deviation from this basic type, that this basic type got already in the Okokova Street Cemetery, which is a pre-emancipation. Basically, it started in 1806, so it could be considered pre-emancipation, particularly in the Pale of Settlement, with these visual representations. And then this visual part slowly became independent in terms of cross-section and in terms of expression from the rest of the gravestone. But it was still basically a variation of the matzeva. Parallel to the matzeva, there is the tree representation. In the first row on the left-hand side, yeah, I always want Bill Gates to punish for these problems of Windows as an operating system, how bad it is. So here you have trees. The first is a branching tree, but the branches are cut back. This is from Bucharest. Then you have a similar tree on which you have a scroll stuck to it with images. It's interesting that in Pravoslav countries, particularly in Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, partly in Romania, you will find the images of the buried, which is rare in Protestant countries, and it's also relatively rare in Catholic countries. Then by the end of the 19th century, the end of the first row, the obelisk. The obelisk takes over, and what is interesting, it is not taking over only in the Ashkenazi space, but it influences Sephardim. It's interesting that Western, the Haskalah, the religious reform of Ashkenazim, impacted the Sephardim. In one generation, they completely abandoned Sephardic traditions and took over Ashkenazi gravestone shapes. For instance, in the second row, you have a couple of Sephardic obelisks, though they are covered with a canopy, but basically it is an Ashkenazic form. Then here you have an interesting example, the Renaissance rabbinic gravestone in the 20th century. You have the two vertical slabs, and between you have this part that connects them, and of course the messages. It's a Hasidic rabbi. And this shows up even in modern period in the Berlin Weissensee Cemetery, where the philosopher Hermann Cohen got such a traditional rabbinic gravestone. I'm not sure that he would have consented to such a shape, but the architect took the decision and he got it. And then we have the column motif, broken column, unbroken column. And then the end of the 19th century is the period when this neoclassical influence gets stronger and stronger. And this is part of this competition. You have, it's 10 meters high, so it's really something that it's too much for a Jewish cemetery, but these are definitely Reformed Jews who feel at ease with all these Christian funerary art achievements. There is a speciality of styles. In Austria-Hungary, you would find more neoclassicism. In Germany, you would find a bit more neo-Romanesque, which is considered to be the national style, referring to the great Romanesque cathedrals in Germany. And then neoclassicism slowly disappears. There are some examples made of metal. Jews were very active in the steel industry, and metal gravestone is visible. Complete metal. It could be a cast iron, it could be wrought iron, it could be partly metal, and it regardless the place. You have St. Petersburg, you have Wrocław, which was Breslau. Regardless the space, you will have the same. It is Bucharest, and then you get the Art Nouveau, the hut motif that dominated the Art Nouveau period, not only in Austria-Hungary, but it was also very prominent in Germany and partly also in Poland. In terms of style, Oriental style shows up, but pretty, it's sporadic. There was a PhD recently that came out as a book about Moorish style gravestones, but it is rather the exemption than the rule. The rule was basically Western major architectural styles. What happened after? In the 1910s and 20s was a very important reform, the Friedhofsreform in Germany, that advocated smaller but more elaborate gravestones. And then you see that the huge monuments started to become smaller. This is a row of graves in Prague, the Žižkov cemetery, in Zagreb, and curiously, in the Soviet Union, and in the Soviet Union you have so beautiful gravestones in the period of Stalin and in the period of Khrushchev. The same applies for communist Bulgaria and communist Romania. Symbols. These are the traditional Jewish symbols, Keter Torah, Birkat Kohanim, the lions. On the right-hand side, the last one below, again, the bookshelf. And then it's interesting how the traditional matzeva with the so-called ears becomes modern. And this is a symbol of solidarity. Each Jewish community has a Hevra Kadisha or has some organizations caring for the welfare of poor Jews. And this is the gravestone, the first that you will be shown if you go to Bucharest, the gravestone of Adolf Hitler. And this other Hitler was written with a double T, and he was an Ish Yakar. I would translate it as a nice guy. You can't translate it. In Slavonic languages, I would say draga. Jakar is draga. So when I talk Croatian or Slovak, I say draga. So it's quite an interesting controversy. Secular symbols. A soccer player. Then a racing car driver. An architect. And over there a painter, and it's Gottlieb, in the Miodowa Street Cemetery in Krakow. Then on the right-hand side, you see a dome hovering over the clouds, a typical synagogue representation for the tablets of the law. But instead of the tablets of the law, you have a synagogue. And this is the gravestone of Leopold Baumhorn, who designed roughly 40 synagogues. So he was the most famous synagogue architect. And there is then the list, the synagogues that he designed. And the list is not good. It was mixed up, so it's interesting. This is my favorite gravestone from the Prague New Jewish Cemetery. This Robert Wolf, might have been an industrialist and with some leftist views. Here you have a factory building from which a Mercury rises. It's a Mercury with all these little wings on his helmet. And he has two hands. With one hand, he gives money to the capitalist, and with the other hand, he gives money to the worker who is carrying the hammer. Such social democratic contents can be observed on many Jewish houses in the interwar period. It was quite common if you tour Vienna, if you tour Budapest. I'm not that familiar with Prague, but this will definitely show up. Inscriptions. The traditional inscription on the left-hand side reads, Yaakov Tzvi, Ben Hayakar. These are given names, and it's the traditional Jewish name that goes after the father's name. Ben Hayakar, of Moshe Segal Löwinger, who was Sofer, Kirchilat, Pressburg. So what here really matters is that he is from a family that is closely related to the Jewish community, because the scribe, the Sofer, is his father. So this is his importance. Now, on the other hand, here we have another situation. Wilhelm Salomon Freund, who was Geheimjustizrat, Dr. Juris Honoris Causa, Ehrenbürger der Stadt Breslau. So he was a honorary citizen, having a honorary doctorate of law, and he was a honorary of the member of the city council of Wrocław. Here is my favorite guy. Ein Leben der Arbeit, gekrönt von Erfolg und Ansehen, ist hier vollendet. A life full of work, acknowledgement, achievement, and success has been ended here. And then you have Hugo Zuckerman in Prague. What is quite interesting, this is already the Czechoslovak period when the official language was Czech. But Jews somehow kept these traditions. The next issue regarding inscriptions is how to deal with people perished in the Holocaust and emigres. So Berthold Steiner is the only one who was buried here, and then his father, Arnost Oswiecim, wife or mom, also Auschwitz, and then the lucky ones who escaped from London, František and Trude Steiner. In the case of famous rabbis, the Hebrew inscription that in the meantime almost entirely disappeared. So in the 19th century, the beginning, it's the Hebrew inscription. Then mid-19th century gets a bit of German, basically in Central Europe. Then this German takes over. And then in some countries, this German is taken over by Croatian, Serbian, Hungarian, whatever you want. And only rabbis get the Hebrew inscription, which gives them a special distinction. It's also about typography. Architect Béla Lajta, who is another Guinness recorder, he created 40 gravestones, designed 40 gravestones. In each 5-6 years, he changed his formal language, always in tune with the general trends of period architecture. And he created also Hebrew fonts. These are traditional Hebrew fonts. But instead of prolonging these letters to have a justified column, he put Hungarian folklore as an inlay. So this is this idea that, yes, he was a famous rabbi who studied the flora and fauna of the Holy Land, but he was nevertheless a Hungarian, and he deserves this Hungarian folklore. And then what you see here is that he created type fonts, Hebrew type fonts, in the spirit of Expressionism and Cubism, which was in fashion around 1907 to 1910-11. Vegetation. Vegetation as something beautiful. Vegetation as framing the cemetery as a whole. Vegetation or smaller metal details. It is all spontaneous vegetation. Basically, cemeteries didn't have planted trees. And then what is interesting, this vegetation, these trees can become landmarks, that they really create a space around. On the other side, you have vegetation which amplifies the idea of this crossing of cargo and decumanus in the old Metropolitan Cemetery in Budapest. Then you have other living beings. This is Wrocław, probably one of the most beautiful examples. The status of this cemetery is cemetery museum that was taken over by the state, I guess, in the 70s, and ever since it is kept by the municipality in this beautiful condition. This is the cemetery for which we were fighting for. You see a tree that started to crash the obelisk, but in the upper corner it holds it. So it grew, deformed, and grew over, now it's whole. Now if you cut the tree, the stone is gone. Let me take now some of the case studies. And this map for the case studies is quite interesting, that Jewish cemeteries indicate the cultural influences in period Europe. So the biggest event in the Jewish history of the last 200 years in Europe is the Haskalah, which started here, Moses Mendelssohn, Berlin, and it spread. It spread to the south, quite interestingly, and overran Sephardic traditions. So if you go to Sarajevo, Belgrade, even Bucharest and Sofia, you feel this Ashkenazi influence. Then it also clashed with the traditional Jewish life in the Pale of the Settlement. And of course, to the west, it was less significant because in Western Europe and in Scandinavia, there were very few Jews. So basically, 75% of the Jews of the world lived in the big empires, the Russian, the German, Austrian, and the Turkish. So the rest was, oops, I again got this, but now I know how to kill it. Yes. And these are the cemeteries that are, it's just a couple of case studies from the book that has 22. I will try to show you a couple of them. Berlin, which is a latecomer among metropolitan cemeteries in Europe, built in the 80s, which has 4 forecourt. So this is still a public space, which is a small square from which you get to the forecourt, and from the ceremonial hall you get to the cemetery proper. The Berlin Weissensee cemetery is absolutely special. It has squares, rotundas, it has diagonal pathways, so it is negating the basic idea of the gridded Jewish cemetery. As an outcome, it has corner monuments that have to address the issue of corner. Upper part, left side, you see it's polygonal because it's on the corner. Another corner monument here. Another corner monument as this rotunda goes on with this hugging Jugendstil big gravestone. Then the Friedhofsreform that starts basically here, that the gravestones got reduced, got traditional elements. Up you see these traditional elements of Jewish gravestones. And below you have the most prominent examples. This is the Hermann Cohen, already mentioned, and Ben Gurion, the writer, who got here a lion. So it's basically going back to the pre-emancipation Jewish tradition, Hebrew inscription, and the shorter German inscription that is unusual, definitely, in these circumstances. Then there is an interesting crossing between Jewish funerary tradition and modernism. This is the gravestone of Laura Perls, who was a client of the famous architect Mies van der Rohe. And Mies van der Rohe built a villa and of course built the gravestone in 1919. So it's a very early modernist gravestone. And another one which is not that much modernist, it's partly expressionistic. This sarcophagus is from Walter Gropius' early expressionistic period as his monument for the Märzgefallene and other monuments. But it already, besides this expressionistic shape, has the typical modern horizontal, vertical L shape. So it is really a transition in 22. Before, in 23, the Bauhaus changed officially from expressionism to modernism proper. This is the Salgótarjáni Street Cemetery in Budapest. which is quite interesting. The gate building shows a sort of neo-Gothic national romantic revival, which is basically Scandinavian. The Hungarians took it over because they thought that they were related to the Finns due to the language, which is partly true. The Hungarian language is an Asian language. Vocabulary really has a couple of Finn words. If I'm in Finland, I can read something from my Hungarian, but basically I use the Swedish from my fluent German. So this German Scandinavian national romantic is the gate building. When you pass the gate, when you look back, you have this medieval blah blah with this traditional, because Hungary was very proud of the medieval past. It was a huge kingdom before the Turks came, and then the Turks ruined everything, and ever since it is in ruined condition. But this medieval, this momentum is there. And when you cross this gate building, you get to the ceremonial hall, which is oriental. It had a dome like this, and it has the battlement. And it is a sort of oriental language, where you have the big wall perforated by little openings. So this is more or less what was visible in Jerusalem, and this is the period when the architects, Jewish architects, started to go back and forth from Budapest to Eretz Israel and back. This is the honorary section of the same cemetery, which is not gridded. The cemetery itself is completely gridded, and here the Hevra Kadisha let people compete. And you have this organic, each is louder than the other. And then you have also these styles, neo-Romanesque, which has little relevance in Hungary. They were still on horse back when Romanesque architecture was being done. So, and then you have the classical, and then you have Art Nouveau. This is probably the best cemetery in terms of greenery, because it looks like an Angkor Wat. And this is an archive image done some 5-6 years ago. In the meantime, the state took over the cemetery and cut the trees for any case that they are not going to ruin the gravestones, but they succeeded to ruin the cemetery as a whole. This is after the tree cutting in winter, and you have also this idea of the districts, pathways, edges. This is a typical district, not yet completely occupied. They closed the cemetery in the 40s, and the big other cemetery took over. This is one of the richest Jews in Hungary, who was not only rich, but he was really generous. He supported modern art and modern literature, so he ran journals, he ran saloons. And interestingly, while he was really an advocate of modernism, his gravestone was still nevertheless schoolish neoclassical. Because Jews who consider themselves very important, they stuck to the tradition, while others were happy to have something new, a fresh air. And this is this three gravestones of Béla Lajta. First, with the Tolos, it plays this game with the antique round temple. Then you have a matzeva, a revival matzeva for a rabbi, and below you have the gate motif. Very often Jewish graves after the Friedhofsreform have the gate as a motive of passing from this world to the other. Łódź. Łódź is the miraculous place, the promised city, which had 6,000 inhabitants in 1800 and 600,000 in 1900. So it was a very fast growing city on the basis of textile industry, in which Jews took a significant part. The Poznański family and some other Jewish families, parallel with some German families, they created one of the biggest hubs of textile industry in Eastern Europe of the time. Of course, they had the big market. They had Russia, because custom borders were dismantled late 19th century in the Russian Empire. So they got a market until Vladivostok. And this has a huge forecourt, the upper slide. Then they arranged a couple of years ago lapidary. And here you have a typical female gravestone with the candles. First I thought that they were prefabricated, they were so similar to each other. No, they are really carved stones en masse. And then we have the richest Jew who later got bankrupt, Poznański gravestone, which is like two Olympic swimming pools with this Jugendstil dome where he and his wife are having this sarcophagi, and then some further family members on this swimming pool a bit further away from the dome. What is interesting about this cemetery, that the industrial architectural language is really present. Here you have, it's almost an industrial building. If you go to the ceremonial building, it will have a truss, an open truss, that a Jewish cemetery would never show elsewhere. It's usually a period synagogue architecture, secular architecture, but never really industrial. Going further from the center of the Łódź cemetery, we encounter a couple of gates. And this is the link. This is the gate to the industrial complex owned by the Poznańskis, and this is a gate, one of the gates to the cemetery. So you have this architectural continuity in terms of material, in terms of shape. And then this image is the Holocaust section, where a rich ex-Łódź citizen, I guess he got rich in America or Canada, and ordered the manufacturing of these concrete frames as the memory to the deceased. And then it was stopped because they were nameless, and it's not really okay in the Jewish tradition to have a nameless gravestone, though it is still a practice. In St. Petersburg, you had a tycoon from the 19th century who said, I don't need my name on the gravestone, everybody would remember me. And I saw similar gravestones in later periods. Now the next shows you a men's section with the book, ladies section with the candles. They are pretty similar. And what is interesting, architectural styles are showing up, but in a very subdued manner. This is Art Nouveau. But it doesn't takes over the whole grave to have this typical Art Nouveau shape. And then you have an ohel. Of course, this is an important rabbi who has this open type ohel, a wall, and inside you have his grave, probably his son, and some other VIPs. Prague, the ceremonial building, gravestone that mimics the rabbinic graves for this mantled medieval cemetery, which was liquidated during the extension of the city. And then you have something which is again against the Jewish tradition. It comes actually from the Zentralfriedhof in Vienna, that you have double rows. And then you have a little gravestone that almost free of charge got this huge frame. He was lucky or unlucky. The question is how do you take it? But it ruined this idea of the community that faces Jerusalem. But it was very practical because you could use space much better. Then in the interwar period, Prague abandoned this practice. And this is this beautiful interwar period set of modernist gravestones. And this is the honorary section along the wall. The wall is always a good opportunity to build a big monument. And here you have Franz Kafka. And for many people, this is the reason to come to this cemetery, but the cemetery is really a great place. And this is the Kozma Street Jewish cemetery in Budapest, which is the biggest in Europe. It has 300,000 burials and 80 hectares. So it is the double of Berlin and even bigger than the Okopova. It has a huge ceremonial hall, and it serves more or less middle classes in the central part. This is another counterexample to Łódź. This is a ceremonial hall with this, let me say, synagogue-like architecture. Architect Béla Lajta created here also a set of gravestones. Art Nouveau, the hut. This is having this Hungarian folklore. This is his first period around 1902 to 6. With the Hungarian honey cake and Mogen David created on the top of Hungarian honey cakes. Not everybody subscribed to this idea of brotherhood between the Hungarian majority and the Jewish minority, but he was doing. Then you have cherub wings, then you have the tree motif. Next stage is expressionism. You have the zigzag, 1907. And these are the interiors of the same gravestones, but it has more Hungarian symbols. In the interior you have a life tree, you have 6-pointed stars. Here he is not going to disturb much Hungarian brethren with Jewish symbols. And then this is probably the funniest gravestone. He described it, it is for my mother and my father. A joke, I mean, it's not my interpretation, it is written in his description. And he went on to be chutzpah and created a set of drawings with a temple like Herod's temple, whatever temple you like, and Yachin and Boaz. And eventually, after 3 years of trying to persuade his clients to take the ship, one accepted. But with a single remark, he wants to have lions here at the end of Yachin and Boaz. And he got his lions. St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is the best survived major cemetery in Russia, which shows Western influence. St. Petersburg is the place of Western influence in the context of Russia. And architect Gewirtz was doing the design. Later, in the Soviet times, he became quite an important person. Probably the communists forgave him to make a sacred building. And then we have a couple of examples that shows you how special this cemetery is. Of course, it is a very rainy climate. Here you have just the center, you have some stones, and then this is for water, and then you have little bridges, a little Venice of the north, like the city. And then you have the influence of Christianity. Here you have an angle. And here you have the image of Mashenka. It's written in Cyrillic letters. Mashenka. And here you have the column, which looks like a Russian oven. And there are many Russian ovens like that also in the Russian Jewish cemeteries. Okopova, I'm not going to talk, you know it much better than me. The Korczak monument, the old sections, and the Ochel, which is quite an atypical Ochel, with this depiction of Babel and the Polish city, and there is just a river and the bridge. You go from the city and watch Babel's tower. And this is the end of neoclassicism. Now you have you see that again this Polish type, traditional matzevot, Art Nouveau, the tree motif, early modernism. This is just statistics of the motifs. And I am ending this show with Vilnius, the Užupis cemetery. What happens if no action is being taken, and even when graves are destroyed on purpose? Vilnius has had a very remarkable Jewish history, and it was remarkably destroyed in the Soviet period, and this destruction goes on also in the so-called democratic period, when the authorities didn't want to have a memorial plaque to the medieval cemetery that was destroyed in Soviet times. What is interesting, it is on a hilltop. Usually Jewish cemeteries are on flat soil. Perhaps Lublin is an interesting exemption because it but this is also a hill, because a big cemetery needs larger space, so this is exceptional. And from this, you get just the remnants of the graves, and you see how nature takes back what was taken from it. And then you have an intervention to make a memorial. There was a gate, and one pillar survived. And this became a memorial gate. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't really like it, but it may be for some people interesting. There are matzevot, some real matzevot, and some fake matzevot, and the wall was built with these gravestones. And I'm an individualist and as a Jew, and I riot against this, making a wall of our gravestones. So I won't like to have something like that in 200 years. Now, this is just a summary. The significance of Jewish cemeteries is cultural and historical. It speaks about the region, it speaks about the Jews, it speaks about the dialogue between them. There is an artistic significance because it reflects how Jews received the arts and how they wanted to mix with the Christians and to take over partly their culture. Importance for the history of regions, and European perspectives. This is probably the most exciting to see how these Jewish families moved. For instance, when the Balkan was liberated from the Ottoman Empire, politically highly incorrect what I told now. When the Ottoman Empire receded by the end of the 19th century, the German Sprachraum overran it, and this shows how this, and with modernity. So I collected a lot of gravestones from the Jewish cemetery in Sofia, and there were photographs, fortunately. So you have the father who wears a fez, and then you have the son, who is a modern guy with a necktie, and you have the wife, the old wife, who looks like a Turkish lady, and the daughter, who is having a hat with a bird feather. So you see these cultural changes in the Jewish society. And then we come to the idea of maintenance and tourism. Cemeteries can be tourist destinations. Some of them in Poland are already significant tourist destinations, while in other places in St. Petersburg, nobody even guessed that it is touristically, or it might be touristically very important. The same problem is in my Budapest, where the synagogue has 500,000 visitors per year. It's almost a good museum can envy the synagogue, but the cemetery is excluded from the tours from an unknown reason, and with that the cemetery deteriorates. So I started calculating, if only every 10th visitor of the synagogue goes to the cemetery, it is then a couple of million euros per year. So this is a way how to restore and maintain synagogues. This is my email. Have some further materials about Jewish architecture, what I don't like the term, but architecture created, designed, or used by the Jews. And the book here, what you have seen, there are 2 copies available. I took with me here to Warsaw. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Klein. We have a few minutes for commentary for the questions, so somebody have a question?
Okay, Rudi, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I have not a question, but a kind of, I even don't know how to say, I'd like to sharpen some points. Basically, I would like to sharpen the majority of your points, but yes. I will stay with only one of them. When you say traditional. Because this idea of traditional is very non-traditional if we look at the long span and the long durée. When you, for instance, you showed the candlesticks for women, and you said, oh, it's traditional. Yeah, it's very traditional when it's used in the 20th century, because it appeared only in the mid-19th century. We see in the mid-19th century it was something very new, and in the beginning of 19th century, in what we see in non-metropolitan cemeteries and small cemeteries, but there is no such women's sign as Shabbat candles. They do not exist. You can find them on the graves of males. And so what, for instance, the appearance of a picture with upper third. Yeah, in Akopova, it's very traditional, but this tradition appeared only in the 18th century. In the cemeteries of the 17th century, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we don't find such images. We don't find images at all. So I would be more careful about using this, because this is very context-dependent thing which we use.
Yes, I was sloppy. I would have to specify pre-emancipation, which century, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Okay, next questions, please.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a really fascinating overview. But I'm wondering what is happening today in places where Jews still live and die, like Budapest, or other similar developments in terms of adopting styles and projecting certain ideas, you know, implanting maybe new images in the past 20, 30 years. Has there been any creativity in this sense?
Yes, definitely. It's interesting that some architectural movements do show up in the cemeteries. So architecture of the 50s, these typical elements of apartment blocks with the bull's eyes, with slanting lines, with framing the entrance, is visible mainly in the Jewish cemetery in Vienna, in the Zentralfriedhof and in the old parts. Then postmodernism is very strongly present in St. Petersburg, with having elements of neoclassical but very freely interpreted, and then in the Balkans. So these post-communist countries are quite interesting. It would be a special study. I spent a week in Sofia. And then you have funny symbols. So, for instance, you have a gravestone of a tycoon. His image is applied. Now there is a technology to put a photograph in stone. And then he would be represented with a table, with a couple of mobile phones, with the Ballantines, and behind a Mercedes. Yeah, so of course each period gives an imprint. Or in the 50s and 60s, you would find radio sets on the gravestones. And you would find also political messages on the gravestones. So in communist countries, very often the six-pointed star is replaced by the communist star. So if you are careful and go, particularly in the Balkans, because Bulgaria was also always between the empires. And between the empires, you have this situation that codification is weaker. Then another interesting issue, strict communism. So Ceausescu regime in Romania. They will have almost identical gravestones, but almost identical. They are not industrially produced. They are just very similar. So there was a strong hand, Mr. Rosen in the Jewish Federation of Romania. Sorry for naming him, it's highly incorrect. But he was the guy who gave an ukaz, you know what ukaz means, I guess, gave an ukaz how a Jewish gravestone should look in the 60s. And then you have a whole section, hundreds and hundreds of gravestones. Yeah, that's it. That's it. That's Bucharest Sephardic cemetery. And also it's partly Ashkenazic, partly Sephardic. So you have the lying slab, you have the vertical slab. So, of course, in the last 30 years, a lot of it happened. Unfortunately, the last couple of years, with the appearance of the Chinese, of artificial stone, are destroying Jewish cemeteries completely. And cemeteries which are in the hands of the Jewish community are more threatened than the ones in municipal ownership, because the Jewish community is eager to sell out these plots near the entrance. So what they do, they sell half of the lane, so the lane becomes narrower, and then you have in miniature gravestones in front of a neoclassical or Art Nouveau monument. So now I'm having difficulties how to photograph this. If I photograph this little Chinese and behind you have a neoclassical monument, then it's problematic. Yeah. So it is losing its language. It's losing its language, it's losing its meanings, and it's losing its Jewishness, definitely. Very pessimistically, but this is it.
Thank you. Who else?
Thank you very much. I have 3 questions. I
Yes.
hope to be quick, but the first is just a sort of an anecdotal question. I was once in a cemetery that had gravestones that were completely in Yiddish. I mean, maybe the name was in Hebrew, but the main inscription was in Yiddish, and that surprised me. So I'm just wondering, this was from the, I believe, the 20s and the 1920s and 30s, so it was a modern, you know, set of gravestones. So I'm just wondering how common that was, because I was surprised to see that. And then I know from the I have to say I'm more familiar with the American context, and I know in the United States that the landscaping of cemeteries, you know, became very important. That in the 19th century, the idea of the cemetery as a kind of park. So you know, it was interesting the way you discussed the cemetery design, comparing it to a city with streets and those kinds of elements. But I'm also wondering how relevant the terms of landscape architecture and kind of park design were to the, you know, the planning and layout of these cemeteries. And finally, I was just curious about when these non-traditional elements, for use of a better term, you know, or let's say non-halachic or halachically problematic elements were introduced, what kind of, you know, controversies were there? Could you say anything about, you know, resistance to, let's say, you know, bringing in elements that were contrary to either just tradition or,
Yeah.
you know, to minhag or to halacha, right? Whether this was a, you know, a source of controversy in the administration of the cemeteries.
Well, I encountered Yiddish sporadically in Bratislava, which was a Yiddish-speaking community for quite a long period. I encountered it in Czernowitz. The rest was basically Hebrew and German and national languages. Landscaping. Of course, the landscape is a problem. And landscaping was the Parkfriedhof. This was this German concept that was accepted mainly in Berlin. Berlin was the most assimilated Jewish community in Europe. Not because it started earlier, but because the Jews had, they were integrated into the general society. And as a matter of fact, when this layout was created, then nobody objected. Now it's another interesting case, the Zentralfriedhof in Vienna, which is also a park with diagonals, with piazzettas, but the Jewish part is gridded. So it was opened in 1873-4, and in that period the Christian part was already a Parkfriedhof, and the Jewish part wasn't. The last was...
the resistance to introducing elements.
Yeah, it was relatively little written about cemeteries. So I read through a couple of Jewish journals from mid-19th century until World War I. Weeklies, monthlies, and the cemetery was not really a big issue. They discussed synagogues. Synagogues were really discussed. They discussed anti-Semitism. The cemetery was not a first-class topic. The first examples that I saw non-halachic, be cautious with non-halachic. You have, even in the traditional, again, I am sloppy, pre-emancipation period, you have had symbols coming from the Gentiles. So the tree is a North European symbol. There are symbols that are not non-halachic, but they are still pre-emancipation. And then in the 80s, I started seeing the opera in Wrocław, the Viennese Staatsoper in Vienna. And so I would say that it is from the 1880s onwards a standard to have these profane symbols. Then tunes, you have even a partitura, if he was a conductor. There's an open partitura and the baton, you know. So there are different, or in Bucharest I saw something amazing, a gravestone some 10 years old of singer twins brothers who were singing and playing the piano. So you have an upright piano, definitely not a concert piano, an upright piano of white marble, and the guy is playing on it. So it is from the 80s, 1980s. So I would say that it is after the 60s, after the Prussian-Austrian War in Central Europe, when this liberal capitalism, this Gründerzeit as they call it, unfolded, and then the Jews considered themselves really part of the Christian Gentile society, and with they took the symbols. And what is interesting, this achievement, secular achievement, they were so ardent to show that they were achieving in secular terms as they were before ardent to show that they were achieving in sacred terms. So it is not the enthusiasm that changed, just the topic is changing. And this changing topic changes the iconography of gravestones.
Thank you. And last question.
Yeah, we are all hungry.
This is really just a continuation of the question about the halacha and minhag and how difficult or easy it is to introduce new elements. And I'm thinking if you're going back to the Mishnah and the Talmud, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that actually in halacha itself, there is more about the question of when to bury the dead and the question of purity and impurity rather than very specific halachic, how the graveyard, how the matzevot should look like. So actually in your introduction from the very beginning, it seems like there's a lot of freedom in terms of Jewish halacha of what gravestones should look like. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it was easier to introduce new elements and you didn't have so much controversy around it.
And it's not only the cemetery. Jews were really eager. They were the first to take Art Nouveau, secession in Vienna. So I wrote a lot about how Jews accepted secession, because there was not the image ban, the image reluctance, the irrelevance of images vis-à-vis the text and content. So image was always a second-class issue. And if it is so, who cares? So let's play with it. And when they became part of the Christian society, then image started to play a role, but it was always second class. It was just showing that we are taking the rules of your game, but we are not taking it really seriously.
Okay, thank you very much.